The sound of leather shoes echoed across the marble floor of the Whitmore estate like a mournful rhythm. Measured, precise, the tempo of a relationship built more on logic than love. Lucas Whitmore, a celebrated architect whose buildings often left people in awe, walked with the same precision he applied to his designs. Neat, calculated, in control. At 41, Lucas embodied the very walls he created. Elegant, solid, but ultimately uninhabitable. He wasn't good at expressing emotion, nor did he believe in spontaneity. Love to him was a concept that couldn't be drafted on blueprints, so he left it out entirely. Clara Marlowe was the opposite. At 35, she spent most of her days in the sunroom at the far end of the estate, her sanctuary. There, she painted botanical illustrations in watercolor, capturing the delicate life of endangered plants. It was the only place where she still felt like herself. 2 years ago, they married, not for love, but for necessity. Clara needed to save her late father's botanical nursery from being sold off. Lucas needed the image of a stable family to assure the company board. They agreed, signed the marriage license like co-owners of a shared property, no emotional liability attached. Since then, they had lived under the same roof, but in different corners of the house. He in his second-floor study, she in the garden studio. Their hands never touched, their eyes rarely met, and every dinner at the long oak table echoed only with the soft clinking of silverware, never with conversation. And though neither of them ever said it aloud, both knew. Between them lay a silence so vast, even the expanse of the estate could not contain it. Neither of them married for romance. For Lucas, marriage was part of a strategy. That year, Whitmore and Vale Studios had just secured a string of international contracts, and the board expected him to present a stable personal image. A man who was settled, reliable, traditional. He didn't resist. Like every structure he had ever drafted, this too was about meeting the brief. Clara, with her quiet beauty, scandal-free past, and a profession that was both artistic and respectable, was the perfectly rational choice. As for Clara, she never imagined marrying out of obligation. But when her father's botanical garden, the place she grew up in, where her mother once planted each seed by hand, stood on the brink of foreclosure, she realized she needed a way out. Lucas offered her one. No pressure, no false pretenses of affection. Just an arrangement that benefited them both. Her family's legacy would be saved. He would have the perfect portrait of family life to present to his board. Everything was clear, efficient, and so they signed the marriage agreement. One signature saved an entire history. One signature quietly closed the door on the possibility of falling in love. Since then, 2 years had passed like an instrumental piece with no melody. Each moved through the house as if the other were a shadow lingering in the frame. No arguments, no bitterness, but no affection either. Just two people, walking silently through a polished performance, day by day, forgetting that something like connection had ever existed. That evening, Whitmore and Vale Studios hosted an art exhibition at the Charleston Museum of Modern Forms. The space shimmered with ambient light, modern oil paintings, and conversations spoken more through glances than words. A string quartet hummed softly in the background, weaving between the clink of glassware and the practiced cadence of networking. Lucas Whitmore arrived as he always did, polished, precise, unshakable. His charcoal suit fit like it had been sculpted onto him. Every movement he made was intentional, measured. He didn't just see the room, he scanned it like a blueprint, evaluating each investor, memorizing the artist's names, calculating proximity and posture like lines and angles on architectural paper. He wasn't here for enjoyment. Events like this were part of the machinery, nothing more. He expected little beyond a few transactional conversations and the occasional handshake, until Clara walked in and time for a moment slipped. She wore a silk sea green dress that clung just enough to reveal her form while still feeling modest. The color made her skin glow under the ambient lighting, and the strands of her loosely tied hair fell around her neck with graceful disorder. The chandelier light didn't seek her out, but somehow it found her anyway. Lucas didn't realize he was staring. She stood near Julian Rhodes, an art historian Lucas had met briefly during an academic panel. Julian was in mid-story, clever, animated, the kind of speaker who layered facts with charm. Clara laughed. Not loudly, it was soft, almost private, the kind of laugh one gives when something lands perfectly. Her head tilted gently. Then almost unconsciously, she touched Julian's arm, a gesture so natural it startled Lucas more than if she had kissed him. Something shifted in his chest. Not jealousy, not quite, but something unsettling, like a minor fault line quietly splitting beneath the surface. A part of him, long buried beneath deadlines, structure, and restraint, stirred. His heart stuttered, not because of Julian, but because of Clara, because of her laugh, because of the ease she radiated, because for the first time, she belonged to the room, not as his wife, not as a formality, but as herself. And what terrified Lucas most was the thought of losing that version of her. He moved, not hurriedly, not dramatically, but each step he took felt louder than the music. When he reached them, he placed a hand gently on Clara's back, appropriate, respectful, but laced with a quiet claim he hadn't meant to reveal. "Julian," he said, voice calm, low, "I see you've met my wife." Clara turned. Surprise flickered in her eyes. Though whether it was at his presence or something else entirely, she didn't know. Julian, ever the poised conversationalist, smiled easily. "We were discussing medieval botanical illustrations. Clara has a beautifully insightful perspective." Lucas didn't respond. His eyes weren't on Julian, they were on Clara. And in that gaze, unchanged in expression but burning in stillness, he truly saw her. And for Clara, it felt like something in the quiet between them had finally stirred awake. On the ride home from the exhibition, the limousine glided silently through the lamplit streets. Inside there was quiet, but not the kind they were used to. This silence felt suspended, as if something was waiting to take root. Lucas sat across from Clara, his hands loosely clasped, eyes fixed on the window, though clearly not seeing anything beyond the reflection of his own thoughts. Clara leaned gently into the seat, letting the rhythm of the car's motion match the unexpected flutter in her chest. She didn't ask why he had approached her that night, or why he had called her "my wife" so deliberately in front of others. But the look in his eyes, so different from every other look he'd ever given her, still echoed in her mind. Then Lucas spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "You seemed happy talking to Julian." Clara turned slightly, caught off guard by the break in their usual silence. "He was curious about my work," she replied. "And to be honest, that doesn't happen often." Lucas nodded, his lips pressed in a line, as if holding back something he hadn't quite prepared to say. Then almost in a whisper, "I should have done that sooner." Clara didn't answer immediately. His words, so simple, so unpolished, touched something more deeply than any eloquent apology ever could. When the car pulled up to the estate, Lucas stepped out first and turned, extending his hand to her. It was a formal gesture, proper and expected, but when her fingers touched his, they held on just a beat longer than they needed to. Under the golden porch light, Clara said nothing, but inside her, something had begun to shift. The next morning, Clara entered the dining room, not expecting anyone to be there. But Lucas was already seated, wearing a light shirt, holding a newspaper, but clearly waiting for something else. "Good morning," he said first. His voice wasn't entirely natural, but it carried effort. Clara nodded gently, a little unsure. "Good morning." He gestured toward the chair across from him. "I thought we could have coffee together today." She sat down, hesitant, but not unwilling. At first, they exchanged polite words about the weather, about how she slept, small, forgettable phrases. But when Lucas asked, "What have you been painting lately?" and waited for a real answer, Clara slowly began to open up. She spoke about a rare orchid species she was recreating from a centuries-old manuscript. Lucas listened, nodding, not out of obligation, but because he genuinely wanted to understand. And in that quiet morning space, with the lights spilling across the table and coffee steaming gently between them, something delicate had begun, like the first lines sketched on a blank page. That afternoon, as the late sun slanted through the windows of the estate, Lucas made his way to the back of the garden, where Clara's sunroom stood. He had never been inside, not because it was forbidden, but because in 2 years he had never thought he was meant to enter her world. The door was slightly ajar. He knocked gently. No reply, but the sound of a pen scratching against paper paused. Clara turned, surprised to see him but not displeased. "Am I interrupting?" Lucas asked softly. She shook her head. "No, come in." He stepped inside slowly, as if each footfall needed permission. The space was unlike anything he'd ever designed. Papers covered the desk, open sketchbooks lay beneath dried flowers, watercolors and porcelain dishes still wet. Nothing was structured, nothing was clean, and yet it was alive. It breathed. "Everything here," he murmured, "feels like a garden painted from memory." Clara smiled faintly, mixing colors on a chipped ceramic palette. He moved closer, his gaze settling on a half-finished sketch of a small flower, its petals thin, slightly drooping. "Does this flower have a name?" he asked. "It does, but I call it the one no one notices. People usually step right over it." Lucas didn't reply. As they both leaned in to examine the same open page, their hands brushed. Just a touch, as light as air. But his eyes lingered on hers, longer than necessary, as if for the first time he was really seeing Clara. Not as a name in a contract, not as a piece of a perfect image, but as herself. Lucas brought up the idea gently, as if not to disturb something fragile. "This weekend," he said over breakfast, "I'm going to check on the old house in Blue Ridge. The roof needs looking at. If you'd like, you could come with me." Clara blinked in surprise, but instead of instinctively declining, she nodded. They left Charleston on a crisp Saturday morning. The road to the mountains wound through tall pines, and the Whitmore family's wooden cabin stood nestled in the soft golden hush of autumn. There was no internet, no assistants, no board meetings, no investor reports. Just the chill in the air, the whisper of wind through shutters, and the faint scent of cinnamon lingering from the old kitchen. Clara felt herself exhale. Lucas did too. That afternoon, they cleared leaves from the porch. Lucas laughed, really laughed, when Clara slipped in a pile of damp leaves and nearly fell into his arms. They stood there laughing, not like business partners, not like strangers in a contract, but like two people who had finally put down their armor, if only for a moment. That evening, they cooked a simple meal together: pumpkin soup, toasted bread, and a bottle of red wine. Clara told stories about her childhood in the backyard garden. Lucas spoke of the first time he built a tiny treehouse at age 10, just to hide from his mother when she made him practice piano. The fire flickered behind them, casting long shadows on the wooden walls. No one talked about the future. No one tried to name the feeling, but something real was forming, quiet and steady, like light finding its way through dust-covered walls. Later that night, Clara stood on the porch, wrapped in a shawl, a warm mug in her hands. Lucas joined her, silent, standing close. After a long pause, Clara whispered, "Tonight, I just want to be myself." Lucas didn't reply. He simply turned to her and nodded. No one touched. No one had to. Because sometimes presence alone is the gentlest kind of embrace. 2 days in Blue Ridge passed as if the world outside had receded by 100 miles. Clara woke early each morning to gather wild lavender, still wet with dew. Lucas started the fire, brewed the coffee. They shared breakfast, not out of routine, but because they wanted to. She spoke more. He listened more. There was no structured effort to improve the relationship, no plan, but also no distance. Just ease. Clara began to see Lucas differently. Not just the cold, calculated architect tied to logic and blueprints, but a man who paused to straighten a windblown sprig of grass. She caught him standing still before a crimson maple, as if speaking silently to a memory. There was gentleness in him she hadn't noticed before, or perhaps he hadn't let it show. Lucas, too, began to understand Clara more deeply. She wasn't just the woman who needed saving to protect her family's land. She was a soul rich with nuance, someone who used every brushstroke to preserve what was disappearing. When she laughed, the world felt less rigid. When she was silent, he learned not to fear the quiet. Something shifted between them. Not loud, not sudden, but sure, like underground water finding its way through dry earth. On the final night before they left the mountains, Clara spoke quietly as they sat on the porch. "I didn't think I could feel this kind of peace with you." Lucas looked at her. The moonlight traced a soft line along her hair like a silent answer. He didn't need to reply. And in that moment, they both believed, perhaps for the first time, that they were finally heading somewhere right. But sometimes, just when trust begins to grow, truth decides it's ready to be revealed. 3 days after they returned from Blue Ridge, Clara received a thick envelope from the family's legal office. Nothing about it seemed unusual. She opened it while making tea, expecting dry paperwork related to the botanical garden, but inside were wire transfer records, contracts, financial summaries from 2 years ago, the exact time leading up to their wedding. One name appeared on every document: Whitmore Holdings. The amount was staggering, enough to erase the bank debt, pay off land taxes, and rescue the entire property. The dates matched precisely with the week Lucas had proposed. Clara stood motionless in the kitchen. Her fingers went cold, not from the tea, but because something inside her had emptied out. She remembered her mother's words after the wedding. "Are you sure, Clara, that this is a choice, not just a rescue dressed in vows?" When Lucas returned home, Clara was in her studio. No paints, no sketches, just her, sitting still, surrounded by silence. "Clara?" he called. She held up the papers. "Did you know about this?" Lucas looked at the documents, brows furrowing, not pretending, but genuinely confused. "What is this?" he asked, voice low. "Money," Clara said, "to save the garden, from your company, transferred before you proposed to me." Lucas took the file and skimmed through the pages, his jaw tightened, eyes narrowing. Then he shook his head. "It wasn't me. I didn't authorize this." Clara let out a dry, brittle laugh. "So what? Some miracle donation from the universe?" Lucas said nothing, and in that silence something shattered. "I thought—" Clara's voice was quiet, deliberate. "I thought we were starting over, but maybe we never really started at all." She rose, walked past him, not crying, not yelling, just disappointed in a way that had no sound. The studio door closed behind Clara, and Lucas stood frozen. In his hands, the stack of documents weighed heavier than paper should, like a verdict. The name Whitmore Holdings, stamped across each page, felt like a brand, pressing into his chest. Everything that had just begun to grow, trust, hope, connection, collapsed in an instant. He didn't know. He truly hadn't known. And that, more than anything, broke him. Lucas walked slowly to his office. The room that once felt like a refuge now felt like a reckoning. He pulled out his phone, scrolled through his contacts, and tapped on the name he had never once questioned. Margaret Whitmore. She picked up on the second ring, calm, composed. "Lucas, did you do it?" he asked, blunt. "Do what?" "The transfer, before Clara and I got married. You orchestrated it, didn't you?" Silence. Just long enough to be confirmation. Finally, her voice came, cool and precise. "You needed a wife who wouldn't shake the image. She needed saving. I ensured everyone got what they wanted, at least on paper." Lucas closed his eyes. "You bought my marriage, and never told me. You took away my right to choose." "What are you upset about?" Margaret replied. "Everything turned out fine. She didn't resist. And you've started to love her, haven't you?" He didn't answer. He couldn't, because even now he wasn't sure anymore. What part of their 2 years had been real, and what had been constructed? He sat down, hollow-eyed. The pages Clara had handed him still in his grip. Now a painful proof of how blind he'd been. For the first time in a very long time, Lucas Whitmore felt like he wasn't in control of anything, and he didn't know if he even deserved a second chance with her anymore. Clara left the estate the next morning without a note. She didn't call it leaving. She just needed to breathe. She returned to the old garden, once her home, now mostly memory. Moss-covered stone path, the bougainvillea her mother had shaped by hand now broken from last season's storm. Clara sat on the weathered bench, palm resting on the cold wood, asking herself, was I wrong from the beginning? Or did I just trust at the wrong moment? She didn't blame Lucas for not telling her. She blamed the fact that he didn't know. Something so important. Yet it had passed him by. That meant there were still gaps between them, too wide for trust to bridge. Clara thought she had moved beyond caution, that she had slowly, truly begun to believe in him. And now what hurt most wasn't just the lie, but that she had allowed her heart to hope. Across the city, Lucas hadn't slept either. He sat in his office, surrounded by unfinished drawings, lights burning through the night. His drafting pen lay untouched, the first time he hadn't wanted to design anything. He wanted to strip it all away. The logic, the control, even the name Whitmore that once felt like armor. He thought of Blue Ridge, of Clara laughing with her hair tangled in the wind, of her pouring tea silently and sliding it toward him without a word. Small things, ordinary, quiet, but full of life in a way nothing else had ever been. Lucas wanted to run to her, but he knew this time an apology wasn't enough. In that stillness, each held a question only the other could answer. If it all began with a lie, could it still end in truth? Neither of them knew the answer, but for the first time, they both wished the answer would be yes. Clara ran into Julian on a rainy afternoon, just as she was leaving an old bookshop near the central square. He was the same, charming, composed, with eyes that always knew when to soften and when to freeze. "Clara?" Julian smiled. "I suppose my timing's perfect." She nodded politely, respectful, distant. They walked a few steps beneath the awning, sheltering from the rain. Julian spoke of an upcoming exhibition in New York, how he needed an expert in antique botanical illustrations, and how you could start over, he said. Then he handed her a letter. Heavy paper, reddish-brown ink, handwriting like verse. But near the end, Clara stopped reading. One line made her heart still. "If what you're living is no longer real, I'm still here, waiting for you to choose something softer." An invitation, but also pity, dressed in poetry. Clara looked up, met his gaze steadily. "You think I need saving?" Julian smiled faintly. "I think everyone needs an exit." She nodded, took the letter, folded it, then slowly tore it apart, piece by piece, the fragments falling onto rain-darkened bricks. "I don't need an exit," she said quietly. "I need the truth, even if it hurts." Julian said nothing. He wasn't surprised, only slightly disappointed. Clara turned and walked away without looking back. She knew she could choose the easier path, but she also knew if she left now, she would carry a question that would never be answered, and Clara Marlowe wasn't built to live in uncertainty. That night, Clara returned to the estate. She didn't text, didn't call. She just needed to know. If she came back, would Lucas still be there? Or would he have disappeared like someone too afraid to stay? But as she stepped onto the familiar wooden porch, she saw him, already sitting there in the dark. No lights, just moonlight and the hush of night insects. Lucas looked up. His eyes held no defenses now, only exhaustion and honesty. "I didn't know," he said, voice rough. "About the money, about my mother. I didn't know." Clara nodded. "I believe you. Now." They sat in silence for a long time. Then she spoke again. "What hurt me wasn't the money. It was believing in something I thought was honest, only to find it had roots in something hidden." Lucas nodded slowly. "I understand, and I'm sorry, not just for what happened, but for letting you walk into this marriage without every piece of the truth." He turned to her, eyes steady. "I won't hide anymore. I won't control things under the excuse of protecting you. If you ask, I'll answer. If you need time, I'll wait." Clara looked at him, and for the first time, she didn't see someone she had to guard against, but a man still learning how to let his walls fall down. "I'm not promising to forget," she said softly. "I'm not asking you to," he replied. The night breeze whispered across the porch. They sat beside each other, not touching. But in that quiet space, something new had begun. Not forgiveness, but a promise. If they were to begin again, this time, it would be with truth. There was no grand announcement, no press release, no slogans. On a quiet autumn morning, Whitmore and Vale quietly launched a new fund, the Terra Fund, a nonprofit community initiative dedicated to supporting independent artists, low-income creative families, and the preservation of local cultural projects. Lucas didn't put his name on the founding board. He didn't call for headlines. He simply told his board, "It's time we gave back, not for branding, for what's right." After weeks of reflection, Clara agreed to serve as co-director of the Culture and Education branch of the Terra Fund. Not because of Lucas, but because she wanted her work to matter, not just within the borders of framed illustrations, but in ways that touched real lives. The new office sat in a converted shipyard warehouse by the river, now reimagined as an open space for exhibitions, workshops, and community events. The walls kept their raw brick. The wooden floors were sanded but not polished, unvarnished, unpretentious. Clara planted a wildflower bed near the front steps. No sign. When people asked, she'd smile and say, "Just walk in. If it feels right, you'll know this space is meant for you." Lucas came in every day, no longer in charcoal suits. He brought coffee for the team, helped move chairs, wiped down walls. Sometimes he just listened quietly to a single mother share how hard it was to keep her after-school art program alive. Neither of them spoke about healing, but in the rhythm of work, in each shared glance, in the way people felt safe inside that space, something real was forming. Not a promise, but something growing, honest, grounded, and fair. One late autumn afternoon, they returned to Blue Ridge. No photographer, no high-profile guests, just a few close loved ones seated on simple wooden chairs in the old clearing, where, the year before, fallen maple leaves had blanketed the ground. Now the space was cleared, smooth, quiet, like their hearts after the storm. Clara crafted her own flower crown from the wild blooms around the hillside, white daisies, purple lavender, and sprigs of foxtail grass. Lucas wore a plain shirt, sleeves rolled, worn canvas shoes on his feet. There was no officiant, no rehearsed rituals, just wind, golden light, and the words they had never said out loud. Lucas stepped forward, taking both of Clara's hands, as if holding something he nearly lost. "I won't promise perfection," he said, voice low but steady. "I only promise to show up every day. No withdrawing, no pretending, no assuming I know what's best." Clara looked at him. Her eyes no longer held doubt. Only one thing, quiet gratitude. "I'm staying," she replied, "not because I need someone to keep me, but because I choose to. I choose this, with you. Each morning, each moment, even when it's hard." No one cried, but every heart softened. Lucas placed the flower crown gently on her head, a movement slow and reverent, like touching something sacred. They didn't kiss like in the movies. They simply pressed their foreheads together, eyes closed. And that was enough. Because sometimes it's not grand vows or sweeping gestures, but the quiet act of choosing to stay, that becomes the truest promise of all. Years had passed, yet the air inside the greenhouse still smelled of lavender and old dreams. On a quiet morning, Clara and Lucas strolled slowly between the rows, through the first space they once built, not as a contract, but as a beginning. Among the bright rows of blossoms, a small child, no more than 4, darted joyfully between petals, holding up a fallen leaf, calling, "Mama, Papa," like a melody echoing in light. Lucas gently squeezed his wife's hand, leaned in and whispered, "We didn't begin with love, but we planted it." Clara looked at their child, at the flowers, at Lucas, and smiled. "And now it lives in everything we've grown."